Here's a question I couldn't answer for most of my life as a Bible reader. How do we know how old something is? Not in a vague sense, I mean specifically. When an archaeologist holds up a pottery shard on a documentary and says, "This dates to the time of David," how does anyone actually know that? What's the method? Who decided? And why should I believe them? For years, I had been accepting those conclusions without understanding the chain of reasoning behind them. I had no idea what was actually going on underneath those claims. This series is about fixing that. Welcome to OT in Context. I'm Scott Smith, a Sunday school teacher from Michigan who got tired of not understanding the world the Bible assumes you already know. Starting today, we're opening a new thread in this series. In addition to geography and history and nations and deep dives, we're going to spend some time on how we know what we know. I'm calling it the How We Know series, and we'll return to it throughout the next couple of years. Today, we start the foundation. Literally. We're talking about stratigraphy, the reading of layers in the ground, and why it matters for anyone who cares about the Old Testament. I want to start by being direct about something. Archaeological evidence gets used in two very different ways when it comes to the Bible. Skeptics cite it to argue that certain biblical events didn't happen or are exaggerated. Defenders cite it to argue that the Bible is historically reliable. Both sides throw around the evidence with confidence. And here's the uncomfortable thing. Many people on both sides, including many serious Bible readers, don't actually understand how the evidence is produced. We know the conclusions, but we don't know the methods. And that matters, because if you don't understand the method, you can't evaluate the conclusion. You're just choosing which authority to trust. And that's not thinking. That's just a different kind of deference. I'll also say this up front. Archaeology illuminates the world of the Bible. It doesn't adjudicate the authority of Scripture. Those are two different things, and keeping them separate is what allows you to engage the evidence honestly without getting rattled by every new headline. I'm not asking you to become an archaeologist, but understanding the basic methods will make you a significantly better reader of the evidence. Whether you're engaging skeptics, studying Scripture, or just trying to follow what you're watching when the next documentary comes out. So, ground floor, what is stratigraphy? Before you can read layers, you need layers to have, and that requires a little explanation. If you've ever looked at a topographical map of Israel, you've probably seen these features that look like odd, flat-topped hills scattered across the landscape. Sometimes they're in the middle of a valley, sometimes alongside an ancient road. Archaeologists call them tells, from a Semitic word for mound, often associated with the Arabic tell. Here's what a tell actually is. It's a city that got built, destroyed, and rebuilt over and over for centuries, sometimes millennia. And even without dramatic destruction events, centuries of mud brick decay, routine leveling, and rebuilding slowly raise the ground surface over time. Think about what makes a location worth settling in the ancient world. You need water, a spring or a stream nearby. You need defensible high ground. You need access to trade routes and arable land. If a spot had those features in, say, 2000 BC, it had those features in 1500 BC and 1200 BC and 900 BC. Geography doesn't change on human timescales. So when a city got destroyed by conquest, by fire, by earthquake, the survivors or the next group didn't usually go somewhere else. They built on top of the ruins. Partly because the location was still valuable, partly because clearing rubble was easier than leveling an entirely new site. Each time a city was built on the remains of the last, the ground level rose a little. Over centuries of occupation, these sites became unnatural-looking hills, taller than the surrounding terrain, with flat tops where the last city stood. Megiddo alone has more than 20 major occupation levels identified by excavations, going back to the Neolithic period. 20 cities, one on top of the other, spanning thousands of years. That is what archaeologists are excavating when they dig a tell. Not just one ancient city, a whole stack of them. So stratigraphy is simply this, the scientific study of those layers. The core principle is intuitive. Deeper usually means older, unless a later pit, foundation, or robber trench has cut down into an earlier layer, which does happen. But in an undisturbed context, if you're digging down and you hit a new layer of occupation, you're going back in time. The artifacts, the architecture, the ash from destruction events, they all correspond to a specific period in the sequence. Archaeologists assign numbers to these layers, called strata. Many Levantine excavations number from top to bottom, so stratum 1 is the most recent, and the numbers increase as you go deeper. But numbering systems vary by excavation. Some sites count upward from the earliest levels. The idea is always the same, even when the convention differs. Each stratum is a snapshot. It preserves what was happening in that city at that moment in history. The layout of the buildings, the objects people were using, and sometimes a stratum ends in a clear destruction event. Widespread burning, collapsed walls, a sudden halt in occupation. The destruction becomes its own evidence. Hazor is one of the most discussed examples. The site has documented occupation stretching back to the early Bronze Age. We're talking nearly 3,000 years of human presence in one location. And then, in 732 BC, it ends. That's the year Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria destroyed it. His own royal annals record the campaign. 2 Kings 15:29 records it from the Israelite side. And in the archaeological record, the site goes silent. That disappearance isn't just a marker dropping off a screen. It represents the end of continuous occupation at one of the most significant cities in the ancient Near East. But Hazor's story doesn't start at its end. Earlier in the sequence, at the close of the Late Bronze Age, roughly the 13th century BC, there's a different and far more violent destruction horizon. Here, the excavators found burned debris, collapsed walls, smashed cultic objects. Someone destroyed that city with deliberate force. The book of Joshua says Joshua burned Hazor. The excavated horizon includes a significant destruction event dated by many archaeologists to the late Bronze, early Iron transition range. That's not proof of anything, but it's what the evidence looks like. And understanding how we know that is what allows you to think clearly about what it does and doesn't establish. Here's the analogy I come back to every time I explain this. Imagine digging through a landfill. In the top layers, you'll find Brita water bottles, Yeti tumblers, and Stanley mugs. But if you dig far enough down, you'll eventually hit the layer containing fondue pots. You don't need a date stamp on a fondue pot to know that it's older than the Stanley mug. The layer tells you that. And in archaeology, the most reliable pottery dates come from pieces found in sealed, undisturbed contexts within a layer. Not surface finds, not mixed fill, but material in place. If you've excavated enough sites and compared enough assemblages, you start to know the sequence so well you can identify a period just by the artifacts. That's exactly what pottery typology does for archaeology. Pottery styles change over time, like fashion. Rim shapes, handles, surface treatment, decoration, they follow recognizable patterns that shift across generations. Once archaeologists had excavated enough sites and compared enough assemblages, they built up a detailed picture of what pottery looks like in any given century. Find a particular rim style in a stratum, and you have a date range. Find it across multiple sites in multiple strata, always in the same sequence, and the sequence becomes a working chronological framework, refined as new excavations and reevaluations come in. This is called ceramic typology, and in Near Eastern field archaeology, it's one of the most powerful dating tools available. It's not perfect. Style varies by region, local traditions lag behind broader trends, and the chronology gets revised. That's normal, That's how the field improves. But it gives you a working framework for every layer you open. Now, I want to be honest about something because I think intellectual honesty here actually makes the evidence stronger, not weaker. Stratigraphy establishes relative chronology. It tells you the sequence. This layer is older than this one. This destruction layer came before this rebuilding. What it doesn't automatically give you is a calendar date. To anchor the sequence to an actual year on our calendar, you need additional methods. Radiocarbon dating can be extremely helpful, especially with good organic samples, but it has its own uncertainties and depends heavily on context. Historical cross-references help too. An Assyrian king list, an Egyptian document, an eclipse that can be precisely calculated. We'll talk about those methods in future episodes. But here's why this matters. A method that knows its limits is more trustworthy than a method that pretends it has none. When archaeologists say that a layer is consistent with a particular period, that phrasing is intentional. It's not evasion, it's precision. The stratigraphy establishes a sequence. The associated pottery suggests a date range. Other evidence narrows it further. The conclusion is presented with appropriate confidence, no more, no less. The 732 BC destruction of Hazor is one of the most securely dated events in biblical archaeology, confirmed by Assyrian records, by the biblical text, and by the material evidence. But the earlier Late Bronze Age destruction we discussed, the stratigraphy is clear. The dating is in a range. The agent is debated. Those are three different levels of confidence. And treating them as equivalent is exactly the kind of mistake that produces bad arguments on both sides. Evaluating what the evidence means, that's the historian's work. And honestly, it's yours too as a careful reader. Next time you're watching a documentary about biblical archaeology or reading a blog post about some new discovery, I want you to ask two questions. What layer was it found in? What else was in that layer? And if you want to go one level deeper, add a third. Was it found in a sealed context or in a fill that could contain mixed material? Those three questions are the beginning of real engagement with the evidence. Not blind acceptance, not reflexive skepticism, just asking how we know what someone is claiming to know. Next Thursday, we're shifting to a completely different scale. Instead of digging down into one site, we're going to zoom out to the entire sweep of Old Testament history. 3,500 years, organized into 5 chapters. A framework I think will change how you read everything else in this series. That's the next episode, the 5 Epochs. I'll see you then.